Ahoy there, fellow psychonauts! Today I want to discuss and attempt to pinpoint Terence Mckenna's political position. I'm going to assume you all know who Terence McKenna is at this point. Ethnobotanist, psychonaut, machine-elves, and all that. To make it clear what I'm talking about without getting too heavy into political theory, I'll first share the Wikipedia explanation of the whole right-wing, left-wing thing. Generally, the left wing is characterized by an emphasis on ideas such as freedom, equality, fraternity, rights, progress, reform, internationalism, etc., while the right wing is characterized by an emphasis on notions such as authority, hierarchy, order, tradition, and nationalism, etc. However, this simple binary of politics is much more complex in reality. For a few examples, the First Workers' International was broken up due to a rift between state communists and anti-state anarchists. Also in the United States, the leftist label libertarian has come to mean a right-wing proponent of the free market, as in people who want some form of market without centralized governments. Introducing the political compass. Now we can distinguish between authoritarian Stalinists and libertarian anarchist communists, as well as neoliberals and market libertarians. Now there are a lot of problems with the compass, and feel free to debate its efficacy in the comments. But in this video, I will be attempting to place Terence's politics within the terms of this compass. Terence has joked about how some have called him the left-wing equivalent of William Buckley, which I definitely wouldn't agree that he resembles Buckley at all, but it shows that some characterize Terence as leftist. If you want to know who William Buckley is, I recommend you watch this episode of his political talk show featuring a young We don't really need to speculate on what his political position is because he freely volunteered it in this video clip.
People can't figure out whether I'm a right-winger, a left-winger, or what I am. I'll tell you straight out, I'm an anarchist. I am an absolute anarchist.
So there it is. He's an anarchist. Anarchists occupy the lowest portion of the libertarian quadrant in the political compass, but now we need to figure out where he lies on the left to right spectrum. But you see, he follows this statement that he's an anarchist with something kind of confusing.
I remember back in the 60s, my line was, if you come upon a mob, you must join, because the people understand far more than you do.
What? This always confused me because Terence is obviously aware of shit like KKK rallies. I feel like this is kind of a misspeak because I'm sure he would not support such rallies. However, this suggests to me a kind of oversight in his follow the people approach. Let's try to clear up this ambiguity between left communism and right capitalism. Terence was a Marxist that was radically changed by the effects of DMT. Following his embrace of metaphysics, he rejected materialism and the philosophy of Marxism along with it. I've noticed that whenever he speaks on the subject of communism, he seems to equate it with the USSR, which I guess kind of makes sense considering that the Cold War was ongoing for most of his life.
Everyone, including myself, and that was the big shock for me, is a creature of their time, and that it's very hard not to serve invisible agendas.
On the other hand, he also heavily criticized Western values, stating that male dominance, bottom-lineism, militarism, materialism, and object fetishism, among other things, were poisoning our minds. He denounced many traditions of Western culture as well, such as the nuclear family and monogamy, along with all those other isms I just mentioned. He even went as far as to say that culture is not your friend, taking what I perceive to be a highly individualist stance. According to Terence, culture was a toxic, dogmatic force that corrupted individuals. He didn't want to side with either America or the USSR and heavily advocated for an ambiguous third way against the two superpowers of his time. He is often quoted as saying, "We are led by the least among us," and he was highly critical of American politicians and governments. However, Terence was much more sympathetic to capitalism, even making statements such as, "I am not anti-capitalist."
I'm not anti-capitalist.
And in another instance, "I think capitalism can be saved."
But I really believe that capitalism can be saved.
I believe he was most likely making appeals for reform to those in power to act on behalf of future generations, even giving some suggestions on how to make money off of saving the world.
If somebody were to give $100 million to some kind of foundation that was called the Save the World Foundation, will generate $8 to $10 million a year.
Gotta appeal to their wallets. He was torn on whether the future of humanity was to serve as stewards of the earth or to become so technologically advanced with virtual reality that we basically transcend space-time. Damn. This shows that he was drawn to some form of both primitivism as well as transhumanism.
Everything else on the earth appears completely primitive, but inside the minds of these people, there are myriad virtual worlds that they're moving in.
A way he saw capitalism could survive itself was by turning physical production into commodities within a virtual space.
I think capitalism needs to sever its connection to materialism. This is again why virtual reality is interesting. You sell things made of light.
Sounds like Bitcoin to me. At the same time, he also believed Western culture was undergoing what he called an archaic revival, which meant societies were developing greater impulses to return to ancient traditions and hunter-gatherer lifestyles. In either case, he really feared the worst, that we are simply doomed and would not be able to break our destructive habits. He was very aware of the data of climate change in the 1990s and often said things like, "We waited till the last hour and the house is burning down around us." It's honestly disturbing to listen to him in the 90s talking about how we have less than 30 years to save the planet. Now, over 30 years later, the discourse is often, will we be able to mitigate the worst effects? And how many of us will survive? By sympathizing with and appealing to many political positions, it really makes it hard to pinpoint Terence's position. But that is kind of his thing, you see. He denounced all ideology as reductive dogmas that led people astray, instead advocating for a focus on the felt presence of direct experience. I will be referring to this as phenomenology.
I hate ideology. All ideology.
Because he rejected ideology, he also rejected the left-wing, right-wing metric of judging people's political stance. Hence, he spoke of that third way. Does this mean that Terence has transcended political labels and cannot be placed on the compass after all? No, of course not. Because I disagree with Terence that one can be without ideology. And to be frank, replacing it with phenomenology is simply nonsensical. Culture and ideology are innate to human beings as thought and imagination are, as I explained in greater detail in my video on that subject. Anti-ideology is an elitist ideology that obscures the person's true leanings. Ideology is not inherently reductive or dogmatic, and it is important to be critical of the ideologies that we side with or lean toward. So where do we place him then? I feared that his stance on capitalism could potentially mean that he was an ANCAP. No, oh god, no. But just because he said he was not an anti-capitalist does not necessarily mean he was pro-capitalist.
Capitalism is as anti-human a philosophy as you can possibly conceive.
For he has expressed his disdain for concepts like free trade.
Don't let anybody kid you. Free trade is a license to peddle crap everywhere. That's what free trade is about.
On the other hand, he thought of so-called archaic styles of living, as in small decentralized tribes of hunter-gatherers, as utopia, which isn't exactly communist. However, it would be a stateless, classless society. hypothetically. Ultimately, though Terence peddled deconditioning from ingrained cultural traditions, something he could not conceive of was society without money. Terence then was some form of eco-market anarchist. So I would place him, drum roll please, center right in the anarchist hemisphere. Congratulations, come on down, Terence. Into the gulag. I don't think this makes Terence a right-winger. I think he's more of a centrist, to be honest. And centrists tend to lean toward the right side of the political spectrum. So he was a right-winger. I'm honestly surprised at how Terence could not imagine a world without money, despite the fact that many cultures he idolized for being archaic continue to do fine without it. I believe a large reason for his attachment has to do with his audience. I mean, ticket prices to his talks weren't cheap. Terence McKenna often spoke to wealthy philanthropists and spiritual entrepreneurs, which inevitably influenced his stance. He claimed that the problem isn't the existence of millionaires, but the existence of excessively wealthy billionaires. Although there's no way to know for sure, Google estimates his net worth of being between $1.5 to $5 million, which allowed him to live comfortably on his plot of land in Hawaii and travel frequently. Even before his rise to fame, he was still wealthy enough to travel the world and attend university. I sense a significant bias when he talks about communism versus capitalism. He would denounce communism as an irrevocable failure and conflate the USSR, Stalinism, and Marxism as if they were all the same thing. But then when he would talk about Western politics, he seemed to point the finger at anything but capitalism. Like, oh no, capitalism isn't the problem. The problem is, describes every aspect about capitalism. Damn near every ism that he lists as a toxic element of Western culture is an essential pillar to the existence of capitalism. It really doesn't matter how many magic mushrooms you eat. The wealthy and powerful are necessitated by the competitive market to exploit the working class and destroy the environment by exhausting resources for their own capital gain. I would hope that after nearly 50 years of irrefutable climate change data and corporations doing nothing but funding denial propaganda and thwarting even the most modest of regulations, that people would recognize that capitalism is the root of our crisis. It is extremely important to recognize that these astronomical crimes continue to be committed by a very small minority of wealthy executives. Just 100 companies are responsible for over 70% of global carbon emissions. The only fault of the greater population is not organizing an effective action and trying these capitalist ghouls in a people's court for crimes against humanity, because this small minority is not being held accountable whatsoever for the millions, perhaps billions of lives they sacrificed for their own self-gain. The latest IPCC report on climate change is horrifying. We are officially in code red. Our summers will continue to get hotter, our sea levels will dramatically rise, and the only way to prevent it from getting worse is by reaching a net zero of carbon emissions as soon as possible. At this point, people don't need psychedelics to save the world. We need immediate collective action. Well, anyways, that's what I could gather on Terence's political stance. I left the links to all my data in the description. The guy did many hours of talks, so if there's something that I missed that adds to or refutes any of my arguments, then please let me know in the comments. I wanted opinions on my desk, stat. This video was made possible by the interbeings of Patreon. Sign up at any tier to become one yourself. One-time payments could be made at paypal.me/interbeinart if you want to throw me a buck or two. Also, follow me on Twitter and Instagram, why don't you? Next time, I will be contemplating whether Terence's time wave theory mythologizes global warming. Subscribe for weekly content. Thank you all for watching and trip safe. Stay cool this summer by organizing a local militia and sunscreen. Allegedly.